Hello, everyone. This is Ali speaking. So, today's topic is about structure and function of the adrenal gland and pancreatic islets. Okay, so let's get to it. Some general info of adrenal gland, guys. You need to know these 4 points. You need to know that the adrenal gland is located superior to the kidneys. You need to know that around it, it's surrounded by the perirenal adipose tissue. And also, it looks like some sort of a half moon shape. And if you look closely, you can see that its thickness is about 4 to 6 centimeter, and its width is 1 to 2 centimeter. Now, this was a general info you need to know about it. Now, this picture, this is all the arteries and veins of the abdominal area. But I want you guys to focus on these three, or we can say four, artery and veins. So these three artery, the superior suprarenal, middle suprarenal, and inferior suprarenal are the arteries that are supplying the adrenal gland. And the vein that is coming from the adrenal gland and draining the adrenal gland is called the suprarenal, but on each side there's only one. But on the right side, it will drain directly into the inferior vena cava, while on the left side it will drain into the left renal vein. Okay? So these are the four structures I want you guys to remember. Now, macrostructure and anatomy of the adrenal gland. Now, the capsule, like any other capsule, or most of the capsules that we know, there will be dense connective tissue. Okay? The blood supply, we already talked about three of them. Now, what happens when these three get to the adrenal gland? Now, what happens inside the adrenal gland? So these arteries, the suprarenal arteries, they become the cortical arteries or arterioles. The cortical arterioles, they become capillaries and sinusoids in the cortex and go through it. After the cortex, they become medullary for the medulla arterioles, and they form fenestrated sinusoids. After that, the drainage starts, so medullary vein, suprarenal vein, and we already mentioned where the right and left go. The right one goes to the inferior vena cava, and the left one to the left renal vein. Now, next thing, we need to talk about the stroma. So the epithelium will be trabecular epithelium, obviously with reticular fibers. And see, you just need to remember that the cortex, when you look at it, is going to be yellowish and medulla reddish and brown. And the cortex and medulla, they have different embryonic origin. As you can see here, the cortex is coming from the mesoderm, while the medulla is coming from the neural crest cells. Pretty straightforward, nothing more to know. Now, this is a summary that I wrote it down when I was learning this topic. So the cortex is divided into 3 zones, and sometimes there will be 4 zones. The main three zones you guys need to know is zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. And the medulla will have chromaffin cells, which they produce catecholamines, which are the general name for the hormones that's produced in that area. We'll discuss it a bit more, but now let's start with zona glomerulosa. Zona glomerulosa, it's getting its name because if you zoom into this area, you'll see a lot of structure that look like the glomerulus in the kidney, so zona glomerulosa. And they produce aldosterone, which the aldosterone is part of the RAS system, which is renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And technically, its main job of this system is to increase the blood pressure. Now, how does aldosterone participate in that? Aldosterone on the DCT, distal convoluted tubule, causes the water and sodium to be reabsorbed from the blood to the blood from the urine, and the potassium to be deposited from the urine. And so we will have an increase in the blood pressure because of it. Zona fasciculata, guys, will produce cortisol. Now, cortisol is a stress hormone. Therefore, it will increase our glucose level in the blood. So it's very important. And also it's important because glucose is the main source of energy for our brain. So it will enhance the glucose to the brain as well. Now, do you remember I mentioned we have 3 zones for the cortex, but occasionally we have 4. The fourth one exists in the zona fasciculata. The lower 1/3 of it will, after, if you zoom into it, sometimes you can see, most of the time you cannot see it, but if you zoom into the cells, you'll see that there's low level of lipid and quite high level of something called the siderophilic granules in the cytoplasm. Therefore, that area, that 1/3, is called zona siderophilis. Okay? Now, the zona reticularis. Guys, before I come here, I need to mention something else for zona fasciculata, and that is zona fasciculata. You will see it's quite like larger compared to the 2 other zones, and you'll see like sort of long columns coming down. That's the best way for you guys to remember that this is zona fasciculata, and the first clue will be from zona glomerulosa. But for zona reticularis, there is no specific like shape that you can remember on your head. The only way you can remember this area is by looking at the difference between zona fasciculata, and there is like a space in between, and then there is the adrenal medulla, which the cells, the nucleus is like stained more darkly, so you can see the difference, and you can figure out there is another zone here. That what is that? Definitely that's going to be zona reticularis. That's how you're going to remember it on the slides. Okay. Now, zona reticularis. Zona reticularis, it produces androgen, which is a male sex hormone. It does produce some more cells, hormones as well, which I mentioned in the next page, but main one is androgen. Okay. Other thing you guys need to remember for this zone is that it contains lipofuscin. Okay. Now we come to medulla. Medulla, as I mentioned, have chromaffin cells. They produce catecholamines. Now, what are catecholamines? Basically, catecholamines are the adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epiphysin or neuroepiphysin, and epinephrine, sorry, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these are the 2 hormones that's being produced in that area. Okay. And technically, this area has muscular veins, and it does produce a very minimal amount of dopamine, which, again, it's good for us to know for this area because it can be one of the questions that can come in the final MCQ exam. Now, more stuff you need to know about the adrenal cortex is this. Adrenal cortex is producing these steroid hormones, but how does a steroid hormone produce? Steroid hormones is produced by 2 main structure. By mitochondria, its tubular part, so tubular crystal mitochondria, and by SCR, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Now, what's the difference between the 2 types of mitochondria? We have a normal or typical crystal mitochondria, which you can see on 19 here. And we have number 20 here, which is the tubular crystal mitochondria. This one, with the help of SCR, is what makes the steroid hormones for us. How does it do it? Basically, the mitochondria have, besides producing the ATP, have this enzyme that converts the cholesterol to the pregnenolone, which is another name for prehormone. And the SCR will convert that pregnenolone to the active steroid hormones. So that's how these 2 work with each other. Next thing we need to know is the how much or how many percentage each zone occupies of the adrenal cortex. So zona glomerulosa is 15%, zona fasciculata 65 to 80%, and zona reticularis is 10%. Now, we need to know what are the shapes for the zona glomerulosa and zona fasciculata. For zona glomerulosa, the structure shape will be columnar cells. For fasciculata, it will be polyhedral cells. And in the fasciculata, if you guys zoom into this picture on the left, you can see that it's separated by fenestrated sinusoidal capillaries. Okay? And in between, if you zoom in a bit more, you can see some lipid droplets as well. I haven't seen much, but when you look at it under the microscope, it's pretty visible. And for zona reticularis, I mentioned there is no specific shape you can remember. Now, in terms of secretion, we know that the main secretion of the zona fasciculata is cortisol. Now, it does produce some minimal amount of aldosterone as well, but you should only mention this if there was a further question. And same thing for zona reticularis. The main secretion is androgen, but the minimal one is estrogen, progesterone, and aldosterone. So my advice to you guys is that don't mention these exception secretion for each zone unless you got asked for it. But it's good for you to know because, if it came in the MCQ questions, it's something that you guys need to know, definitely. And it could be an easy question for you guys to score a good point. Now, adrenal medulla. Now, we already talked about what the adrenal medulla has. We said that it has chromaffin cells. We said already that it has darkly stained cells. They're separated by reticular fibers. We already said these. What you need to remember that chromaffin cells, we call them chromaffin cells, but they're not actually cells. They're modified sympathetic postganglionic neurons. You need to mention this name. I know it's too long, but this is a very key point to know what's the difference between chromaffin cells and other cells. And that is they're neurons, but they're lacking the axon and dendrites, and they're secreting. They're only secreting cells. So all these together has caused for us to call them chromaffin cells. Now, the medulla has dual blood supply. What does that mean? That means that there is two different version of blood being supply into that area. One, we already talked about it. The suprarenal arteries become cortical arteries, and the cortical arteries go through all the three different zones and then to the medulla. We already went through this. But there's a second version of supply, and that is when the suprarenal arteries or some part of some branches of them, they go straight through the cortex and become the perforating arteries. And these arteries just supply the medulla. Okay? And how does the secretion takes place in the medulla? So it's the secretion of medulla is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay? And the sympathetic nervous system, the nerve for that area is the great splanchnic nerve, which goes and gets its preganglionic fiber to that area and causes the hormone release in that area. Finally, a picture of the slide you guys need to know. My bad. This is a zoomed out version of the slide, which you can see only the adipose tissue, the medulla, and the cortex. If you zoom in a bit, you'll see the three different zones and the medulla. So this is the capsule. You can see zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, as I mentioned. It's quite large and longer compared to other two zones. And zona glomerulosa, you guys can see that it looks like glomerular structures. And zona reticularis and the medulla here. Next thing, I tried to zoom into these two slides just for you guys to maybe have a better look at the glomerulosa and fasciculata area. And remember that there is spongiocytes on the zona fasciculata. How do you need to look at them? Like this. Spongiocytes are basically, they have a lot of lipid droplets in themselves. So you can stain it by oil red, which is the stain we use for lipids. And obviously, you need to embed it with gelatin as well. Now, this is another picture for you guys to compare the zona reticularis and medulla, because as I mentioned, there is no specific shape for zona reticularis. So you need to understand that there is the medulla, there is the zona fasciculata, and in between you can see that this is zona reticularis. So this was adrenal gland. Now, let's go to the islets of Langerhans. Islets of Langerhans are the endocrine portion of the pancreas. There is an exocrine portion, which is covered by the serous acini cells. And serous acini basically produce the pancreatic juice of the pancreas. Now, let's dive back to the islets of Langerhans. Islets of Langerhans, they are mostly found in almost all part of the pancreas. They have a thin connective tissue capsule, obviously with reticular fibers. There is polyhedral cells, and the epithelium is very important to remember that it's a trabecular epithelium, which usually is with fenestrated capillaries. And the four or more cases, 5 important cells you need to know inside the islet of Langerhans are these. There is alpha cells, beta cells, delta cells, gamma cells, and epsilon cells. The alpha cells are pretty clear. They produce glucagon, and glucagon increase the blood glucose, right? Now, if you stain the slide with Gomory's staining, you will see like red cells quite a lot in there, and those will be the alpha cells. Now, on the contrast, when we have beta cells, which produce insulin and decrease the blood glucose level, when you stain it with Gomory's, it will be blue, and with aldehyde fusin, it will also be staining darker than the other cells in that area. And there will be more like most abundant cell in the islet of Langerhans. On the other hand, we will have delta cells, which they will be less abundant, and they will be somatostatin. Again, guys, don't forget that the somatostatin in pancreas is not the same as the somatostatin you find in produced by the hypothalamus. They're totally different secretions. However, they both inhibit the secretion of other hormones in that area. Okay? Now, next thing you guys need to remember is the gamma cells or the F cells or the pancreatic polypeptide cells, which they produce pancreatic polypeptides and they are self-regulatory, obviously. But what this hormone does is that it stimulates the activity of the gastric chief cells in your stomach. And also, you can find mostly these cells at the head of the pancreas. So these are the main 4 you need to know. And there's a 5th one as well I found it interesting, which is the epsilon cells. And the epsilon cells produce ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone that causes hunger, and it will increase your appetite. So guys, this is like a pretty well summary of what you need to know about islet of Langerhans. But some additional things you guys can remember or sort of refresh your memory, I'm pretty sure you know this already, is the regulation of the activity of alpha and beta cells. So alpha and beta cells, their activity is regulated by the level of glucose in the blood, and the normal will be about 70 milligram per deciliter. Now, if it's obviously goes higher, if we have high blood glucose level, the alpha cells, they will get inhibited and beta cells starts working. They produce the insulin, lower the blood glucose level. But if we have low blood glucose level, the alpha cells are stimulated and the beta cells are inhibited. Alpha cells obviously will cause the glucagon to promote the glucose digestion in the liver. Now, and increase the blood glucose level. Now, the sympathetic nerve fiber and parasympathetic nerve fibers, what is the role of them in this related to these cells? Sympathetic nerve fibers is mostly activated when you're in a fight. So it's a fight or flight reaction. So you need a lot of energy. So you need a lot of glucose. So there it will stimulate the increase of glucagon and inhibit the release of insulin. While in the parasympathetic system and parasympathetic nerve fibers in that area, it's when you're relaxed, right? So it will increase the secretion of both hormones and they will be at this almost same level. They are going to be in an equilibrium. Now, diabetes. What is diabetes? I'm pretty sure you guys already know. Diabetes is when you don't have enough insulin. Your cell doesn't have enough insulin to function. So you will have high glucose level in the blood. That's what diabetes means. And next thing you guys need to know is the types. 1 second. The types will be type 1 and type 2. Now, the type 1 will basically be more visible in children. That means that the beta cells, which is responsible for insulin production, have been sort of some way damaged. We don't know why, but somehow they have got damaged. Autoimmune damage of them has caused them to be less functional, so less insulin is being produced. Therefore, the glucose level is high. So by injection of insulin, the children will be fine and that patient will be fine. Now, diabetes type 2 is mostly seen in adults, especially the ones who are obese. And the reason for it is that the receptors of insulin have got damaged. The receptors of insulin that are on the cell, around the cells. So insulin level is enough. However, the insulin receptors are damaged. What they're supposed to do, they need to cut down on their weight. They need to get thinner. Therefore, those remaining receptors which are still functional and can detect the insulin level, they will take over and they will be enough for that patient. So whenever the person is obese and has diabetes mellitus type 2, they need to basically cut down from their weight. That's how they're going to get treated. And I put like 3 different pictures of the slide you might see on the microscope, just so you guys get familiarized with it. So this is the islets of Langerhans slides, which you can easily see the islets, you can see the serous acini cells in these areas, and I really advise you guys to put this picture to like your head, your heart, whatever you want to do. Remember this because this is one of the easiest slides you guys can have on the exam, and you can easily get quite a lot of mark for it just by knowing which slide is this. You get quite a lot of points. So it's very important for you guys to detect it. And now this is another picture zoomed in. Again, it's H&E of the islet of Langerhans and the serous acini cells around. I like this picture a lot because this staining is not H&E. This is aldehyde fuchsin staining. And as we mentioned before, aldehyde fuchsin is one of these stainings which is very important for beta cells because you can see the beta cells of the islet of Langerhans in that area. Next, this is another type of staining that it's quite visible to, not quite visible, but you can easily get these in the exam. I personally had this staining, the immunohistological staining of beta cells in the exam. And thankfully, I did remember this picture. So remember these 3 different pictures and also the fuchsin one. Fuchsin, you saw it already, but the H&E version, which is the easiest version of the staining for islet of Langerhans, remember it by heart, guys. Okay? And that will be it. I hope you guys enjoyed it and see you soon.